Thank you for being here tonight. Wherever you are in this moment, whatever weight you've carried through your day, you can set it down now. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go. Just let yourself settle into this quiet space we're creating together. Tonight, I'm going to share 6 stories with you. 6 small windows into lives lived slowly, simply, with attention to the smallest things. These are stories about people who understood that peace isn't something we achieve or earn, but something we notice, like light through leaves or the temperature of stone in afternoon sun. You don't need to follow every word. In fact, if your mind begins to drift, if the stories blur into images and sensations, that's exactly right. Let my voice become like water moving over rocks, constant and soft, asking nothing of you. Take a breath if you'd like. Let your body grow heavy where it rests, and we'll begin. In a village that sat in the fold between 2 mountains, there lived a woman named Keiko who had spent 40 years making paper. Not the paper that comes in smooth white sheets from factories, but the kind made by hand, one piece at a time, from the inner bark of mulberry trees. Her workshop stood at the edge of the village, a small wooden building with walls that had weathered to the color of driftwood and a roof of curved tiles where moss grew thick on the northern side. On this particular morning in early autumn, Keiko walked the path from her house to her workshop just as the first light was touching the top of the eastern mountain. The air held that special quality it has just after dawn, when coolness and warmth exist together, when you can smell both the night that's ending and the day that's beginning. She wore simple indigo cotton, a jacket and loose trousers, and wooden sandals that made a soft clapping sound against the packed earth of the path. The path itself was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and it wound between stone walls covered in ivy and small ferns that grew from cracks in the mortar. Someone long ago had planted maple trees along this path, and now they formed a gentle canopy overhead. In spring they offered shade, and now, in this early autumn, their leaves were just beginning to turn, a few bright red ones scattered among the green like paper lanterns lit from within. Keiko walked slowly, as was her habit. She had learned long ago that hurrying changed nothing except her own breathing, and she preferred to arrive at her work calm, with her mind already settled into the rhythm of making. She noticed as she walked that spiders had been busy in the night. Their webs stretched between branches, catching the early light so they appeared as strings of silver beads suspended in the air. Most people would have walked through them without seeing, but Keiko saw them and stepped carefully around them, bending low where she needed to, letting the spiders keep their night's work intact. As she reached the workshop, she paused before opening the door. This was another habit, this moment of standing still, of noticing the threshold between outside and inside, between the walking self and the working self. She looked back at the path she'd just traveled, saw the way the light was now touching the stone walls, turning them golden, and she felt something like gratitude, though she wouldn't have named it that. It was more like recognition, a small bow of attention to the morning, to the path, to the gift of being able to walk it one more time. Inside the workshop, everything was arranged as it had been for decades. The light came in through high windows on the eastern wall, falling in long rectangles across the wooden floor. There were low tables for working, and along one wall, shelves held stacks of finished paper, each piece slightly different from the next, no two exactly alike. In the corner stood the vat where she would later mix pulp with water, and beside it, the screens she used for forming each sheet. But first, there was the wood for the fire. The workshop was warmed by a small clay stove, not so much for comfort as for helping the paper dry evenly. Keiko had stacked kindling and larger pieces of oak beside the stove the evening before, as she always did, so that morning work could begin smoothly, without the jarring work of chopping or searching for fuel. She knelt beside the stove, feeling her knees settle into a position they'd taken 10,000 times before. There was a comfort in this, in the body knowing what to do without being told. She arranged the kindling with care, not rushing, crossing the small sticks so air could move between them, so the fire would have room to breathe and grow. On top of the kindling, she placed 3 pieces of oak, each about as thick as her wrist, positioning them so they formed a small teepee with darkness at its heart. The matches were kept in a small ceramic box, dark blue with a crack along one side that had been repaired with gold lacquer years ago. This repair technique, called kintsugi, celebrated the crack rather than hiding it, making the box more beautiful for having been broken. Keiko took a single match, struck it against the rough side of the box, and watched the flame spring to life. For just a moment, she held it, watching the fire consume the wooden stem, feeling its heat against her fingers. Then she lowered it to the kindling. The fire caught slowly, as good fires do. First there was just smoke, pale gray wisps rising from where the match touched the wood. Then a single small flame appeared, hesitant, testing the air. Then another. Within a minute, the kindling was crackling softly, and the larger pieces of oak were beginning to blacken at their edges, preparing to burn in their own time. Keiko stood and moved to the center of the workshop, where a cushion waited beside one of the low tables. This table held a single object, and it was this object she had come to observe this morning, as she had observed it for many mornings before. It was a stone, just a stone, really, nothing precious or rare. She had found it 3 years ago in the river that ran along the base of the eastern mountain. It was roughly the size and shape of a small melon, gray with threads of white quartz running through it, and a texture that was somehow both rough and smooth, depending on where you touched it. Keiko settled onto the cushion and placed her hands in her lap. She had no agenda with this stone, no purpose or goal. She simply looked at it. This was a practice she had learned from an old papermaker who had taught her when she was young. He had told her that before you could make anything beautiful, you had to learn to see completely. And seeing completely meant looking at one thing long enough that you stopped thinking about it and started actually seeing it. The stone sat on a piece of unfinished wood, old cedar that had darkened with age. In the morning light, she could see the texture of its surface more clearly than at other times of day. There were small pits and hollows, places where softer mineral had worn away over centuries of water flowing past. The white quartz threads didn't run straight but curved and branched like the veins in a leaf, and if she looked closely, she could see that the white wasn't really white at all, but contained hints of pink and gray and even, in one place, a faint green. She noticed a small shadow on the stone's surface, cast by a tiny protrusion, barely bigger than a grain of rice. This small mountain on the stone's landscape caught the light in a way that made it visible only from this angle, at this time of morning. By afternoon, it would disappear into the general texture of the stone. But now, for these few minutes, it existed as a distinct feature, a place worth noticing. Time passed. Keiko didn't count minutes or worry about how long she'd been sitting. The fire in the stove had grown strong now, and warmth was beginning to fill the workshop. Outside, she could hear birds beginning their morning conversations, the sharp call of a jay, the softer chattering of sparrows. A breeze moved through the high window, carrying the scent of chrysanthemums from someone's garden. The The stone revealed itself slowly. She began to see that its gray was not one gray but many, layers of color that shifted depending on how the light hit its surface. In some places it was almost blue, in others nearly brown. Where the white quartz threads ran thickest, the surrounding gray seemed darker, as if the brightness of the quartz made the stone itself retreat into shadow. She noticed her own breathing had slowed to match the pace of her looking. Each breath came and went without effort, like waves reaching a shore. Her shoulders had dropped away from her ears. Her jaw had softened. There was no tension in her body because there was no task to complete, no right or wrong way to observe a stone. There was only this: the morning light, the gray and white surface, the texture and shadow, the simple fact of its existence and her attention to it. After a time she couldn't name, Keiko bowed slightly to the stone, as if thanking it for its patience, and rose from the cushion. Her legs were stiff, but pleasantly so, the stiffness of being still rather than the exhaustion of effort. She moved to the wall where her tools hung on wooden pegs, each in its designated place. The work of paper making begins long before the actual making. There are materials to prepare, fibers to process, water to ready. But this morning, Keiko was in the middle stage of a batch, where the kozo bark had already been boiled and beaten and was now resting in clean water, waiting to be formed into sheets. She filled a large ceramic pitcher from the rain barrel that stood outside the workshop's back door. The water was cold and clear, and she carried it carefully, both hands supporting the pitcher's weight, feeling its coolness against her palms. She poured this water into the vat, watching how it caught the morning light as it fell, how it splashed against the vat's wooden sides before settling into stillness. Next came the pulp. It waited in a wooden bucket, looking like nothing so much as thick cream, pale and fibrous. Keiko scooped a handful, feeling its cool weight, its slippery texture. She let it fall from her hands into the vat, watched it disperse slowly through the clear water, clouding it, transforming it. She added more, handful after handful, until the ratio felt right. This wasn't something she measured anymore. After 40 years, her hands knew. She stirred the mixture with a long wooden paddle, moving it in slow circles, feeling the resistance of the pulp against the water. The motion was meditative, requiring just enough attention to stay present, but not so much that her mind couldn't rest. Around and around, the paddle moving through the milky water, the fibers beginning to separate and distribute evenly throughout the vat. When the mixture was ready, Keiko lifted the screen from its resting place. The screen was made of fine bamboo strips bound together with silk thread stretched across a wooden frame. It was old, this screen, older than Keiko herself. It had been her teacher's screen and his teacher's before that. The bamboo had darkened with age and use, and the silk thread had been replaced many times, but the frame was original, made from some hardwood that refused to warp or crack no matter how much water passed over it. She held the screen flat and lowered it into the vat, letting it sink beneath the surface of the pulp mixture. Then, with a motion that had become so natural it was almost involuntary, she lifted it up through the water, tilting it slightly as it rose, allowing excess pulp to drain away while keeping enough on the screen to form a sheet. The timing of this lift, the angle, the speed, these were what determined the thickness and evenness of the paper. Too fast and the sheet would be thin and fragile. Too slow and it would be thick and uneven. The screen came up through the water, and on its surface lay a thin layer of pulp already beginning to take on the appearance of paper. Water dripped through the bamboo strips, returning to the vat in a steady patter that sounded like light rain. Keiko held the screen level, watching the water drain, seeing where the pulp had distributed itself, where it was slightly thicker or thinner. Each sheet told her something about her technique, about the mixture, about the pressure and speed of her lifting. She carried the screen to a rack where sheets would be pressed and dried. With a practiced motion, she flipped the screen onto a piece of felt, and the wet sheet of forming paper released from the bamboo, settling onto the felt like a sigh. It was beautiful in its wetness, almost translucent, the fibers visible as a delicate web of connection. Again, Keiko returned to the vat. Again, she lowered the screen, lifted it through the water, carried the forming sheet to the drying rack. The repetition was not monotonous but rhythmic, a kind of walking meditation performed with hands and water and wood. Each sheet was slightly different, a reflection of that particular moment, that particular lift, the way her body balanced, the way her attention held. The morning continued this way, paper forming sheet by sheet, the stack on the drying rack growing slowly higher. Sunlight moved across the workshop floor, illuminating dust motes that drifted through the air like snow. The fire in the stove had settled into steady warmth. Outside, the world went about its business, but inside the workshop, time moved at the pace of water draining, of pulp settling, of fiber binding to fiber to become something new. Keiko made 20 sheets before she felt the need to rest. She set the screen aside, wiped her hands on a cloth that hung from her waist, and returned to the cushion near the stone. Her hands were wrinkled from the water, and her lower back held a gentle ache from bending and lifting. These sensations were familiar, almost welcome. They were the signs of work done with attention, of a body used in the way it was meant to be used. She sat and breathed and looked at nothing in particular. The stone was still there, exactly as it had been, unchanged by her absence. The light had shifted now, coming from a higher angle, and the small shadow she had noticed earlier was gone. The tiny protrusion now lit from above, invisible against the general texture of the stone's surface. She thought about the paper she had just made, though thinking wasn't quite the right word. It was more like her mind simply rested on the images of those 20 sheets, white and wet and waiting to dry. Each one would become something, perhaps a letter, perhaps a painting, perhaps a page in a book, or perhaps it would simply exist as paper, as the thing it was, without needing to become anything else. This was what she loved about her work. The paper she made asked nothing, it offered itself. What others did with it was their concern. Her concern was this, the making, the attention to water and pulp and pressure and time. The rest was beyond her hands. She sat until her breathing had completely settled, until the gentle ache in her back had faded, until she felt ready to return to the vat and make 20 more sheets. This rhythm of work and rest, of action and stillness, was how she moved through her days. Not pushing, not forcing, but allowing the work to unfold at its own pace, which was also her pace, which was also the pace of the morning itself, moving from shadow to light. In the foothills of a mountain range that had no name in any language tourists spoke, there was a garden that belonged to no one and everyone. It had been planted, or begun, or perhaps simply allowed to grow, decades earlier, by a man who had lived alone and died without heirs. The land had reverted to the village, But the village had no use for a garden of stones and moss and carefully pruned pine trees, so they simply let it be. Over time, people began to visit it, to sit on the weathered bench beneath the old pine, to sweep leaves from the paths, to trim back the bamboo when it grew too ambitious. One such person was a man named Toshi, who came to the garden on the seventh day of every month. He came not because of obligation or schedule, but because 7 is a good number, neither too frequent nor too rare, and because rhythms matter to a life the way roots matter to a tree. Today was the 7th day of the 10th month, and Toshi walked up the long slope from the village center as the afternoon sun slanted through the trees. He was 73 years old, though his body moved like someone younger, and his mind worked like someone who had learned the value of slowness. He carried a bamboo rake, its tines worn smooth from use, and a small basket for collecting leaves. The entrance to the garden was marked by 2 stone posts, nothing more. No gate, no sign, no indication of what lay beyond except the suggestion of a path continuing into shadow. Toshi paused at these posts as he always did, setting down his rake and basket, placing his palms together, bowing once. This bow was not religious, exactly, though it wasn't not religious either. It was acknowledgement of the garden, of the man who had made it, of the mystery that some places hold more peace than others. He picked up his tools and entered. The path led first through a corridor of tall bamboo, their stalks so close together they formed living walls on either side. The light here was greenish, filtered through thousands of narrow leaves, and the air smelled of earth and something else, something clean and slightly sweet that Toshi could never quite name. The bamboo created a kind of doorway between the village and the garden, a transition space where the concerns of the village could be set down, left behind like mud scraped from boots. After 20 paces, the bamboo opened into the garden proper. It was not large, perhaps the size of 2 houses placed side by side, but it had been designed with such care that it seemed to contain multiple smaller gardens within itself. A stone path wound through it, not straight but curving, so you couldn't see the whole garden from any single point. You had to walk to discover it, and each turn revealed something new or something old seen from a fresh angle. The center of the garden held a pond, shallow and irregular in shape, its bottom lined with smooth, dark stones. A small stream fed it, trickling down over rocks arranged to create a sound like constant, gentle rain. In summer, the pond held lotuses, but now in autumn it held only water and reflection, the sky caught in its surface along with the shapes of surrounding trees. Beside the pond grew the pine tree, gnarled and ancient, its trunk thick as 3 men and its branches extending in careful, sculpted curves. Someone, the garden's maker, or perhaps others after him, had trained this tree over decades, wiring branches, trimming growth, encouraging it to grow not as pines naturally grow, reaching straight for the sky, but as an expression of patience and vision. Its needles were long and dark green, and they carpeted the ground beneath it in a soft mat. Toshi walked to this tree now, his feet finding the path from memory rather than sight. He set down his basket and his rake and simply stood, looking up into the branches. The afternoon light came through the needles and shafts, dusty gold, solid enough to touch. A small wind moved through the tree, and the branches swayed slightly, and the light shifted, and everything was both permanent and changing at once. He breathed the smell of pine resin and old wood. He heard the water trickling into the pond. He felt the air on his face, cool but not cold, carrying the first real hints of the winter that would come in another month or 2. and he felt something in his chest loosen, some tightness he hadn't known he was carrying until it began to release. This was why he came. Not to rake leaves, though he would rake them. Not to tend the garden, though he would tend it. But for this moment, this standing and breathing and letting something tight become loose. After a time, he moved his attention to a particular stone that sat near the path, about halfway between the pine tree and the pond. It was not the largest stone in the garden, nor the most dramatically shaped. It was, in fact, quite ordinary, roughly rectangular, about knee-high, dark gray with flecks of mica that caught the light when the sun hit it directly. But this stone had become, over the years of Toshi's visiting, a kind of companion. He had sat on it, leaned against it, simply looked at it through all seasons and weathers. He had seen it under snow, covered in cherry blossoms, surrounded by falling maple leaves, wet with summer rain. And each time, it was the same stone, and each time, it was completely different. Today, Toshi approached it slowly, taking note of what was new. Someone, perhaps children from the village, had placed 3 small, smooth pebbles on its top surface, arranged in a triangle. A snail had left a silver trail across one side, a path that caught the light like a thread of silk. And at its base, in the small space between stone and earth, a cluster of tiny mushrooms had appeared, pale brown with delicate gills, pushing up through moss and pine needles. Toshi knelt beside the stone, his knees cracking slightly, and examined the mushrooms more closely. They were perfect, each one, their caps still partially curled, not yet fully opened. They would last perhaps 2 or 3 days before collapsing into themselves, returning to the earth they'd emerged from. But for now, they were here, vital and fragile, demanding nothing, offering everything. He reached out and touched the stone's surface, feeling its coolness, its slight roughness. The mica flecks sparkled under his fingertips, tiny worlds of light embedded in the stone's dark matrix. He wondered, not for the first time, where this stone had come from. Had the garden's maker found it nearby and carried it here? Had it been brought from the mountain? Had it always been here, and the garden built around it? These questions had no answers, or rather, the answers didn't matter. The stone was here now. That was what mattered. It had weight and texture and color. It occupied space. It endured weather. It gave home to moss and mushrooms and provided a surface for snails to cross. It was itself, completely itself, asking nothing, being everything it was. Toshi sat back on his heels and looked at the stone from a slightly greater distance. From here, he could see how it related to the other elements of the garden. It sat in conversation with a smaller stone to its left, and together they created a kind of balance, a visual rhythm that was satisfying without being symmetrical. Behind it, across the path, 3 tall iris leaves stood in a cluster, brown now in autumn, but their vertical lines contrasted beautifully with the horizontal mass of the stone. The garden's maker had understood something about arrangement, about how objects in space create meaning through their relationships. The stone wasn't beautiful alone, or wasn't only beautiful alone. It was beautiful in context, as part of a larger composition that included water and wood and sky and every other element that the garden held. Toshi thought about his own life, the way different parts of it had seemed meaningful or meaningless depending on what surrounded them. A difficult year had felt unbearable at the time, but looking back, it had been necessary, had taught him things he couldn't have learned in comfort. A moment of joy had seemed small when it happened, but in memory it had grown, had become one of the bright stones in the stream of his years. Perhaps, he thought, We are all like this stone, not beautiful or meaningful in isolation, but part of a larger pattern that we can't see because we're inside it. And perhaps peace comes from accepting this, from being fully what we are in the place we've been set, trusting that our presence matters in ways we'll never understand. He stood, feeling his knees protest slightly, and picked up his rake. The leaves had begun to fall in earnest now that it was mid-autumn, and the paths needed clearing. Not because leaves were bad or wrong, but because a path is meant to be walked, and walking is easier when the way is clear. Toshi began at the far end of the garden, near where the bamboo corridor opened into the space. He worked slowly, pulling the rake through its arc, gathering leaves into small piles. The sound was satisfying, a soft shushing as the bamboo tines moved through pine needles and dried maple leaves. He didn't try to get every leaf, didn't aim for perfection. That wasn't the point. The point was care, attention, the gesture of tending. As he raked, his mind wandered, and he let it. He thought about his grandson, who was struggling in school, who found reading difficult and math frustrating. He thought about his daughter, the boy's mother, and how worried she was, how she talked about tutors and special programs. He wished he could tell her what he was learning here in this garden, that struggle is part of growth, that the crooked branch can be more beautiful than the straight one. But he knew she wouldn't hear it, not yet, not while worry filled her ears. He thought about his wife, dead now 5 years, and how she used to laugh at him for coming to this garden every 7th day. "Talking to rocks again?" she'd say, teasing but affectionate. He missed her laugh. He missed the way she'd touch his arm when he was worrying about something, just a light touch, her way of saying, "You're here, I'm here, that's enough." He thought about his own death, which couldn't be too far off now, given his age. He didn't fear it exactly, but he wondered about it. Would it hurt? Would he know it was happening? Would there be time to say goodbye to the people he loved? Or would it come suddenly, a door closing with no warning? These thoughts came and went like clouds crossing the sky. He didn't grasp at them or push them away. He just let them move through while his hands moved the rake, while leaves gathered into piles, while the afternoon continued its slow slide toward evening. When the paths were clear, Toshi collected the leaf piles into his basket. He would take them to the compost area behind the garden, where they would break down over winter and become food for next year's growth. Nothing wasted, everything returning, the endless cycle of transformation that made life possible. He carried the basket through the bamboo corridor, deposited the leaves, and returned to the garden. The sun was lower now, painting everything gold and orange. The pond had become a mirror of fire, reflecting clouds that had gathered on the western horizon. Toshi returned to the bench beneath the pine tree and sat. This bench had been here as long as the garden, a simple wooden seat, weathered to gray, worn smooth by decades of people sitting. It faced the pond, and sitting here, you could see most of the garden, could watch how light changed it, how weather moved through it, how each season dressed it in different colors. He sat and breathed and let his body rest. The work of raking wasn't hard, but it was work, and he was old enough now that his body asked for rest more often than it used to. This didn't sadden him. It was simply true, the way autumn following summer was true, the way leaves falling from trees was true. From somewhere in the village below, he heard a bell ringing, marking the hour. Children's voices carried up the slope, laughing, calling to each other. Life continuing, ordinary and precious. Toshi thought about the stone he had observed earlier, still sitting in its place near the path. He thought about its permanence and the mushroom's impermanence, and how both were perfect, how neither was better or worse than the other. The stone would be here long after Toshi was gone, would outlast his grandson's grandson, and the mushrooms would be gone in days, would return to earth and feed the moss that fed the garden. Everything in its time, everything with its own kind of permanence and impermanence, its own way of being in the world. He felt grateful suddenly, though he couldn't have said for what exactly. For the garden, yes. For the bench beneath the pine tree. For the ability to still walk up the slope on the 7th day of the month. For the leaves he'd raked and the stone he'd observed and the water trickling into the pond. For the life he'd lived, with its joys and sorrows, its mistakes and small victories. For his wife's laugh, even though he'd never hear it again. For his daughter's worry about her son, because worry was love wearing another face. For everything, all of it, the whole impossible, beautiful, painful gift of being alive and aware. The sun touched the horizon, and the garden's colors began to deepen. Soon it would be dark, and he would need to make his way back down the slope to the village. But not yet. For now, he could sit here, an old man on a weathered bench, breathing the cooling air, watching light fade from water, feeling at peace with the day, with the month, with the life that had brought him to this particular 7th day in this particular season. He sat until the first star appeared in the darkening sky. Then he stood, bowed once to the garden, and picked up his empty basket and his bamboo rake. The path down would be darker, but he knew it well. His feet would find the way. There was a temple, very old and very small, that sat at the edge of a cedar forest where the mountain began its steep climb toward clouds. The temple was so far from any town that few pilgrims ever found it, and those who did arrive had usually taken a wrong turn and stumbled upon it by accident. It had no grand hall, no famous Buddha statue, no claim to historical importance. Just 3 small buildings with curved tile roofs, a courtyard of raked gravel, and a bell tower whose bronze bell was green with age. A single monk lived there, a woman named Etsuko, who had come to the temple 30 years earlier as a young novice and had simply stayed. Over time, the other monks had left or died, and the main temple in the valley had forgotten this place existed, or had decided it wasn't worth maintaining, and Etsuko had found herself alone, which suited her perfectly. She woke each morning when the quality of darkness changed. That moment before dawn when black becomes gray, when the world holds its breath between night and day. She woke without an alarm, her body knowing the time the way birds know when to sing, the way flowers know when to open. This morning in late autumn, she woke to the sound of rain on the temple roof, a soft, steady percussion that had probably been falling for hours. She lay still for a moment, listening, feeling the weight of her quilts, the hardness of the wooden pillow beneath her neck. The room was cold. Her breath made small clouds in the darkness. But the cold was clean, honest. Not the damp cold that got into bones, but the clear cold of mountain air. She rose and dressed in the dark, pulling on layers of cotton and wool, wrapping herself until only her face showed. She lit no lamp. Her feet knew the way through the small room, past the low table, around the corner, to the door that opened onto the covered walkway connecting her quarters to the main hall. The rain was heavier than it had sounded from inside, falling in gray sheets from a sky that seemed to press down on the mountains. The courtyard had turned from white gravel to gray water, small rivers forming between stones, running toward the drains at the corners. The cedar trees beyond the courtyard wall were dark shapes in the rain, their branches heavy with water, bending slightly under the weight. Etsuko crossed the walkway, her footsteps hollow on the wooden boards, and entered the main hall. Here, she did light a lamp, a small oil flame that pushed back the darkness just enough to see. The hall was simple, bare wooden floors, white walls, and at the far end, a small altar with a bronze incense burner and a scroll hanging behind it. The scroll showed a circle, drawn in a single brush stroke, imperfect and perfect at once. She approached the altar, knelt, and lit 3 sticks of incense. The smoke rose straight at first, then wavered, following air currents she couldn't see. The smell was sandalwood and something else, something slightly sweet and slightly bitter at once, like memory. Etsuko sat in meditation, her spine straight, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't try to empty her mind or achieve any particular state. She simply sat, breathing, watching thoughts rise and fall like the smoke from the incense. A thought about the leak in the storage building's roof. A memory of her teacher, dead now 15 years. A fragment of a sutra she'd memorized as a girl, wondering if the rain would last all day, noticing a pain in her left knee, noticing the noticing of the pain. Time passed. The oil lamp burned lower. The incense turned to ash. Outside, the rain continued its steady falling. Etsuko sat, still and attentive, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, just present in the dark hall with the smell of smoke and old wood and rain. When the meditation was complete, she rose, bowed to the altar, and moved to the small kitchen attached to the side of the hall. Breakfast would be simple: rice, pickled vegetables, tea. The same breakfast she'd eaten for 30 years, and before her, the monks who'd lived here had eaten it for 100 years before that. But before eating, there was work to be done. The rain had reminded her of the leak in the storage building, and leaks grow worse when ignored. She would need to see how bad it was, whether it could wait until the rain stopped or needed immediate attention. She pulled on a wide rain hat made of oiled paper and bamboo and stepped out into the weather. The rain was cold on her face, soaking through her robes almost immediately despite the hat. She crossed the courtyard, her feet splashing through water that was already ankle-deep in places, and opened the door to the storage building. The leak was in the northeast corner, where she'd known it would be. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, falling into a spreading puddle on the wooden floor. The sound it made was lonely, a single note repeating, echo in the empty building. Above the drip, she could see where tiles had shifted, leaving a gap for rain to enter. Etsuko stood and looked at this leak for a long time. The building was old, older than the main hall, perhaps the oldest structure in the temple complex. Its roof had been repaired many times, tiles replaced, wooden supports reinforced. But age was winning, the way age always wins. Eventually, this building would need to be completely rebuilt, or it would simply collapse under its own decay. She thought about the monks who had built this building, whoever they were. Centuries ago, they had cut trees, shaped wood, fired clay into tiles, fit everything together with care and skill. They had intended this building to last, and it had lasted, but nothing lasts forever. Even mountains wear down eventually, even stone becomes sand. This didn't sadden her, this fact of impermanence. It was simply the way things were. The teaching at the heart of her practice: nothing remains. Everything changes. Clinging to permanence brings suffering. Accepting change brings peace. Still, the floor was getting wet, and wet wood rots, so something needed to be done. She found a ceramic bowl in the corner, large enough to catch the dripping water, and positioned it under the leak. The sound changed from water hitting wood to water hitting water, a softer, more musical tone. She stood for a moment longer, listening to this sound, watching the ripples spread across the bowl's surface each time a drop landed. There was something hypnotic about it, something that drew the eye and quieted the mind. Just water falling, just ripples spreading, just the sound marking time in an otherwise silent building. When the rain stopped, she would climb onto the roof and adjust the tiles. For now, this bowl would do its job, everything in its time. Etsuko returned to the main hall, removed her wet outer robe, and hung it near the brazier to dry. Then she went to the kitchen and prepared her breakfast. The rice cooker was old, dented, its inner pot stained from years of use. But it still worked, still transformed raw rice and water into something nourishing. She measured rice by hand, added water by feel, and set it to cook. While the rice cooked, she prepared tea. The tea kettle was iron, blackened with age, heavy in her hands. She filled it with water from the stone cistern that collected rain from the roof, set it on the brazier. The fire beneath had burned down to coals during her meditation, and she added a few sticks of kindling, blew gently until flames reappeared. Waiting for water to boil was its own kind of meditation. Etsuko sat on a low stool, watching the kettle, listening for the change in sound that would tell her the water was ready. First there was silence, just the crackle of burning wood, then small bubbles forming on the kettle's bottom, making a quiet singing sound, then larger bubbles rising, a sound like wind in pine trees. Then the full boil, a rushing that meant the water had transformed from liquid about to become steam. She poured the boiling water over tea leaves in a small clay pot, waited for it to steep, poured it into a cup that had been her teacher's cup and her teacher's teacher's before that. The cup was plain, brown clay, slightly lopsided from being handmade, with a small chip on the rim that had been there as long as Etsuko could remember. She held the cup in both hands, feeling its warmth, smelling the tea's grassy, slightly bitter scent. The first sip was hot enough to hurt slightly, hot enough to demand complete attention. She couldn't think about anything else while drinking tea this hot. She had to be fully present, fully aware, feeling the heat, tasting the flavor, experiencing just this moment and nothing else. By the third cup, the tea had cooled enough to drink more easily, and the rice was ready. She filled a bowl, added a few pieces of pickled radish from the jar she'd made in summer, and carried everything to the low table in the main hall. She ate slowly, chewing each mouthful completely, tasting the rice's slight sweetness, the radish's salt and sour. Outside, the rain had lessened to a drizzle, and through the open door she could see mist rising from the warm earth, white wisps climbing toward gray sky. After breakfast, Etsuko washed her dishes in cold water, dried them, put them away. Then she returned to her quarters to change into dry work clothes. The rain had stopped completely now, and pale light was breaking through the clouds, illuminating the wet world with a soft glow that made everything look new. She spent the rest of the morning doing small tasks, sweeping the walkways, trimming bamboo that had grown too close to the storage building, checking the garden where she grew vegetables in the warmer months, now mostly empty except for a few hardy greens. Each task was done completely, with full attention, before moving to the next. Around midday, she returned to the main hall and sat again in meditation. This time, she faced a different direction, toward the eastern wall where a small window looked out onto the forest. Through this window, she could see a single pine tree, old and twisted, growing from between two large rocks. This tree had been there longer than the temple, probably, its roots working deep into cracks in the stone, finding soil and water in places that seemed impossible for life. Etsuko had looked at this tree thousands of times over 30 years. In spring, it produced small cones. In summer, its needles were darkest green. In autumn, they faded slightly. In winter, they bore snow without breaking. She had seen it in dawn light, noon light, twilight, moonlight, in rain, in sun, in fog, in wind, and every time she saw something she hadn't noticed before. Today, what she noticed was the way two of its main branches had grown. They extended from the trunk at nearly the same height, one reaching left, one reaching right, but over decades they had curved back toward each other, so their tips were now quite close, separated by only a hand's width of air. They hadn't touched, but they'd grown in relationship to each other, as if aware of each other's presence, as if their growth had been a kind of conversation carried out over decades in the language of wood and needle and slow change. She thought about relationship, about how we grow in response to those around us. Her teacher had shaped her, not through explicit instruction so much as through presence, through example. She had watched how he walked, how he held his teacup, how he responded to frustration or joy with the same quiet steadiness. And without trying to copy him, she had grown toward those qualities, the way the branches grew toward each other. Everyone we meet shapes us. Every conversation, every shared silence, every conflict and reconciliation, every moment of connection or distance. We are not separate beings bumping against each other, but part of a larger pattern. Roots intertwining underground where we can't see, branches reaching and curving in response to the presence of other branches. This thought gave her comfort. Even here, alone in this forgotten temple, she was not really alone. She was part of the forest, part of the mountain, part of the rain that fell and the mist that rose. She was in relationship with the tree beyond her window, with the stones beneath it, with the monks who had built this place centuries ago and the monks who might come after she was gone. All of it connected, all of it one fabric woven from countless threads. The afternoon passed quietly. Etsuko read from a sutra book, the pages yellow with age, the text written in a hand so beautiful it was itself a form of meditation. She mended a tear in her robe, her needle moving in and out of the fabric, each stitch small and even. She sat zazen again, watching her breath, watching thoughts, watching the watching. As evening approached, she walked the perimeter of the temple grounds, following a path that ran along the inside of the low stone wall. This was her daily practice. This walking, a way of checking on the temple, of noticing what had changed since yesterday, what needed attention, what was growing, what was dying. Today, she noticed that one of the cedar trees had dropped a large branch in the wind and rain. It lay across the path, still green, its needles thick and fragrant. She would need to move it, cut it into pieces for firewood. But not now. Now she just noticed it, acknowledged it, added it to the list of tasks that made up her days. She noticed spider webs heavy with raindrops, each drop containing a tiny reflection of the world. She noticed mushrooms pushing up through moss, their caps bright orange against green. She noticed the stone lantern near the gate was leaning slightly more than it had been, its base probably undermined by the rain. She noticed bird tracks in the mud, 3 toes forward, 1 back, a pattern repeated in a wandering line that told the story of a bird's search for food. By the time she completed her circuit, the sun was setting behind the mountains, turning the western sky gold and pink. Etsuko returned to the main hall, lit the evening incense, and sat in meditation as darkness gathered around her. This was her favorite time of day, this threshold between light and dark, when the world grew quiet and the boundary between inside and outside, between self and other, seemed to soften and blur. She sat in the darkening hall, the oil lamp unlit, watching the last light fade from the circle on the scroll behind the altar. When full dark came, she lit the lamp, closed the hall, and returned to her quarters. She ate a simple dinner of rice and pickled vegetables, drank tea, and sat by her window looking out at the night forest. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, a sound both lonely and completely at home. Before sleeping, Etsuko wrote in her journal, as she did every night, just a few lines about the day, the rain, the leak, the tree beyond the window, the fallen branch. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would interest anyone else, just the small events that made up a day in a forgotten temple on a mountain far from anywhere that mattered. She wrote by lamplight, her brush moving across the paper, characters forming in black ink. When she was done, she set the brush aside, blew out the lamp, and lay down beneath her quilts. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was the owl calling again, and somewhere farther away, another owl answering. In a valley where 3 rivers met, there stood a house made of river stones, each one carried from the water and set into place by hand over the course of many years. The house belonged to an old fisherman named Kenji, who had lived his entire life beside these rivers, who knew their moods and seasons, their depths and shallows, the way other people knew the faces of their children. Kenji was 84 years old, his body bent from decades of casting nets and hauling boats, his hands rough and scarred, his face weathered to the color and texture of driftwood. He lived alone now, his wife dead, his children grown and moved to cities where they worked in offices and had forgotten the sound of running water, the smell of river mud, the feeling of a fish pulling against a line. But Kenji didn't mind the solitude. He had the rivers, and the rivers were company enough. Each one had its own personality, its own way of moving, its own gifts and dangers. The northern river was fast and cold, running down from mountain snow, full of trout that flashed silver in the sunlight. The eastern river was slower, warmer, winding through farmland, home to carp that grew fat on insects and grain that washed in from rice paddies. The southern river was the widest and slowest, almost lazy, full of catfish that hid in the mud and came out at night to feed. Where the 3 rivers met, there was a sandbar that appeared in late summer when the water was low and disappeared in spring when snowmelt made the rivers swell. This sandbar was Kenji's favorite place in all the world. He would take his small boat out to it, pull the boat onto the sand, and sit there for hours, watching the 3 rivers flow together, watching the water from 3 different sources become one river flowing south toward the distant sea. On this particular autumn afternoon, the sandbar was still above water, though not by much. The autumn rains had raised the rivers, and in another few weeks, the sandbar would be gone until next summer. Kenji rowed his boat slowly across the current, feeling the push of the water against his oars, adjusting his angle to compensate. The boat was old, like him, its wood-weathered gray, its paint mostly gone, but it was sound, well-maintained, faithful. He reached the sandbar and pulled the boat up onto the sand, securing it with a rope tied to a driftwood log that had been there for as long as Kenji could remember, too heavy to wash away even in spring floods. Then he walked across the sandbar to his usual spot, a slight depression in the sand that formed a natural seat, and sat down. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, but the breeze coming down from the mountains was cool, and together they created a perfect temperature, neither hot nor cold. The sound of the 3 rivers meeting was constant, a rushing that changed in tone as wind shifted or as boats passed somewhere upstream, but always there, always present, like breath, like heartbeat, like the baseline hum of existence itself. Kenji sat and watched the water. Where the rivers met, their different colors were visible, at least to eyes that knew how to see. The northern river's water was clearer, slightly blue-green. The eastern river was browner, carrying silt from farmland. The southern river was darkest, full of tannins from forest soil. For a short distance, these colors remained separate, three ribbons braiding together. Then, gradually, they mixed and became one color, one river, the distinctions disappearing into unity. He thought about his life, which had been like these rivers. Different parts, different sources, different qualities, all flowing together to become the single stream of his days. His childhood in this valley, learning to fish from his father and grandfather. His young adulthood, when he'd traveled to the city, trying to make a different life, only to find the city hollow, unreal, built on paper and promises rather than stone and water. His return to the valley, to the rivers, to the life he'd been meant to live all along. His marriage to Fumiko, who had been a city girl and had struggled at first with the isolation, to the simplicity, but who had eventually come to love the valley as much as he did. Their children, 3 daughters, each one born in the stone house, each one learning to swim in these rivers before they learned to read. The years of raising them, teaching them to respect the water, to understand its power and its generosity. Then the slow departure, one by one, as the daughters grew up and left for schools, for jobs, for lives that didn't include rivers or fishing or stone houses. They visited sometimes, bringing grandchildren who were frightened of the water, who stared at their phones instead of watching the light on the river's surface. These visits made Kenji both happy and sad, happy to see his daughters, sad to realize they'd become strangers to the place that had made them. And finally, Fumiko's death 5 years ago now, sudden and unexpected, her heart simply stopping one morning as she swept the front step. He'd found her there, the broom still in her hand, her face peaceful, as if she'd just paused for a moment to rest. The shock of it, the impossible emptiness, the months of walking through days that felt like walking through fog, everything muffled and distant and unreal. The rivers had saved him, or rather, the rivers had been there, constant and indifferent to his grief, and their constancy had been what he'd needed. Every morning, he could come down to the water and know it would be there, flowing as it had always flowed, as it would continue to flow long after he was gone. This permanence in the midst of loss, this continuation in the face of ending, had given him something to hold on to when everything else felt like smoke. He picked up a handful of sand and let it run through his fingers, watching the grains fall, feeling their slight weight, their grittiness. This sand had been rock once, mountains, great stone masses that had stood for millions of years before water and wind and time broke them down into smaller and smaller pieces. And this sand would continue to break down, would become silt, would wash downstream to the sea, would settle on the ocean floor, and eventually, millions of years from now, would be compressed back into rock, and the cycle would begin again. Nothing was permanent, but nothing was lost. Everything transformed, changed form, became something else. The water in these rivers had been snow on mountains, rain from clouds, moisture drawn up from the sea. It would flow to the sea again, would evaporate, would form clouds, would fall as rain or snow, would return to the mountains, around and around, the great wheel turning, everything in motion, everything returning. A fish jumped in the water near the sandbar, breaking the surface with a splash, then disappearing back into the current. Kenji smiled. He wasn't here to fish today, had brought no nets or lines. He was just here to sit, to watch, to be present with the rivers. But seeing the fish jump reminded him of all the years he'd spent fishing these waters, all the thousands of fish he'd caught, all the mornings and evenings on the water. He'd eaten some of those fish himself, had sold others at the market in the village, had given others away to neighbors and friends. Each fish had been a gift from the river, and he'd tried to receive that gift with respect, with gratitude. He'd learned over decades to take only what he needed, to return the small fish, to fish in ways that didn't deplete the river's population. This was sustainability, though he'd never used that word. It was simply wisdom. The understanding that you couldn't keep taking without giving back, that you were part of a system, not separate from it, not master over it. The sun moved lower in the sky, and the shadows grew longer. Kenji shifted slightly in his sandy seat, easing a stiffness in his hip. His body complained more these days, reminding him constantly of his age, of the limited time remaining, but he didn't resent these aches and pains. They were honest messengers, telling truth about the state of things. He looked downstream, where the unified river flowed south between green hills toward distances he'd never traveled. He'd been content to stay here, in this valley, beside these rivers. Some people needed to wander, to see the whole world, but Kenji had found that staying in one place and watching it closely could reveal just as much. The rivers changed every day, every hour. The light changed. The seasons changed. Fish came and went. Birds migrated through. Plants bloomed and faded. There was endless variety in this one place, if you paid attention. A heron landed on the far edge of the sandbar, a blue-gray shape moving with careful deliberation, each step measured, each movement economical. Kenji watched it without moving, barely breathing, not wanting to disturb it. The heron stood motionless for a long moment, then suddenly struck, its beak darting into the shallow water. It came up with a small fish, silver and wriggling. The heron tossed its head back, swallowed, and stood still again, waiting for the next opportunity. This was how life worked, Kenji thought. Patience and attention, punctuated by moments of swift action. The heron didn't worry about whether fish would come. It simply stood and waited, alert and ready, trusting that the river would provide. And the river did provide, because that was the river's nature, to flow and to carry life within its current. Kenji had tried to live this way, patiently, attentively, trusting that life would provide what was needed. And mostly, it had. Not always what he'd wanted, but what was needed. The distinction had taken him years to understand. Want and need were different things, and happiness came from aligning them, or from releasing want and accepting need. He'd wanted Fumiko to live longer, to grow old with him, to sit here on this sandbar together watching the rivers meet. But what he'd needed was to learn to be alone, to find his own center without depending on her presence. Her death had been terrible, the worst pain he'd ever felt. But it had taught him something he couldn't have learned any other way. It had taught him that he was strong enough to endure, that love didn't end with death, that connection persisted even in absence. The heron finished fishing and flew away, its wings broad and slow, its long legs trailing behind. Kenji watched until it disappeared beyond the trees. Then he turned his attention back to the water, to the place where the three rivers became one. He thought about all the water that had passed through this spot. Every drop that had ever flowed in these rivers had passed through here, had been part of this meeting and mingling. billions of gallons over centuries, over millennia. Water that had touched every part of the watershed, every stone and tree and creature that lived near the rivers. Water that had carried minerals from mountains, nutrients from forests, dissolved oxygen from rapids and waterfalls. Water that had given life to everything it touched, and he was made of water too, mostly. His body was more water than anything else, water held in the temporary shape of skin and bone, water that had come from these rivers through the fish he'd eaten, through the vegetables grown with river water, through the cups of tea he'd drunk every day of his life. His body was not separate from the rivers. It was part of them, shaped by them, sustained by them. When he died, his body would return its water to the rivers, one way or another, either through burial, his body slowly decomposing, its moisture seeping into soil and eventually into groundwater that fed the rivers, or through cremation, his water released as steam that would form clouds and fall as rain and return to the rivers that way. Either way, his water would rejoin the greater flow, would become part of the endless circulation that connected all life. This thought didn't frighten him. It felt right, natural, appropriate. He'd taken from the rivers all his life. It was only fair that he'd return what he'd borrowed. Nothing truly belonged to him. His body, his life, even his thoughts and memories, all of it was borrowed from the greater flow, from the universe that had assembled these elements temporarily into the pattern called Kenji, and that would someday dissolve that pattern and reassemble the elements into other patterns, other lives, other forms. The sun touched the western hills, and the light turned golden. The water caught this light and threw it back in sparkling flashes, thousands of small suns dancing on the surface. Kenji squinted against the brightness, but he didn't look away. This beauty was temporary, would last only a few minutes as the sun descended, and he wanted to witness all of it. He thought about beauty, about how much of it he'd seen in his 84 years. Sunsets and sunrises, storms and clear skies, the first flowers of spring, the last leaves of autumn, the infinite variations of light on water. He'd seen his daughters as babies, their tiny, perfect hands, their wondering eyes. He'd seen Fumiko laughing, her head thrown back, completely unself-conscious. He'd seen fish leaping, herons hunting, eagles soaring, otters playing in the shallows. So much beauty, offered freely, asking nothing in return except attention. The world was generous beyond measure, constantly creating and displaying and offering beauty to anyone who would stop and look. This generosity humbled him, made him grateful, made him want to live his remaining time as beautifully as he could, as a way of honoring all the beauty he'd received. The golden light began to fade, shifting toward the deeper orange and red of approaching sunset. Kenji knew he should start back soon, before it got too dark to row safely. But he allowed himself a few more minutes, watching the colors deepen, watching the way the shadows of the hills stretched across the water, watching the day prepare to end. He stood slowly, his joints stiff from sitting, and walked back to his boat. He untied the rope from the driftwood log, coiled it neatly in the boat, and pushed off from the sandbar. The current caught the boat immediately, pulling it downstream, and he had to row hard to angle it back toward his landing spot on the northern bank. As he rowed, he looked back at the sandbar, at the place where he'd sat, at the meeting point of the three rivers. It would still be there tomorrow and the day after, and for all his remaining days. He could come back whenever he wanted, could sit and watch and think and simply be present with the flowing water. This was a kind of wealth that had nothing to do with money, a richness that poverty couldn't touch. He reached the landing, secured the boat, and walked up the path to his stone house. Smoke rose from the chimney of a neighbor's house farther up the valley, and lights were beginning to come on in windows. Evening was settling over the world, and with it came that particular quality of peace that belongs to the end of day, when work is finished and rest is near. Inside his house, Kenji lit a lamp and prepared a simple dinner: rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables, a piece of grilled fish he'd caught yesterday. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, grateful for the food, for the hands that could still prepare it, for the body that could still digest it and turn it into energy and warmth. After dinner, he sat by his window looking out at the dark shapes of the hills, at the stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue of the sky. He thought about the rivers flowing in the darkness, continuing their eternal motion whether anyone watched or not. He thought about the sandbar, covered now by night, waiting for tomorrow's sun. He thought about the heron, roosting somewhere in a tree, and the fish swimming in the dark current, and all the life of the valley settling into sleep. He felt tired, a good tiredness, the kind that comes from a day fully lived. He would sleep soon and sleep well, and wake tomorrow to do it all again. The simplicity of this life, the repetition, the daily return to the same tasks and places, this was not boredom but contentment. This was knowing what mattered and doing it, day after day, until the days ran out. Before sleeping, Kenji stepped outside one last time. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were brilliant, more stars than anyone could count, more than anyone could name. He looked up at them for a long moment, these distant suns, these ancient lights, and felt both infinitely small and infinitely connected. He was one tiny part of an incomprehensible vastness, but he was part of it, not separate from it, not less important than any other part. He went back inside, lay down on his futon, and pulled the quilts over himself. The last thing he heard before sleep took him was the distant sound of the rivers, flowing, always flowing, carrying their water toward the sea. In a town that had grown too quickly, where old neighborhoods pressed against new apartment buildings, where the past and present stood side by side but rarely spoke to each other, there lived a baker named Hana. She ran a small shop on a corner that had held a bakery for 80 years, first her grandmother's, then her mother's, now hers. The building was old, wood and plaster, with a storefront that opened directly onto the street and living quarters above. Hana woke at 3:30 every morning, while the town was still completely dark and silent. She woke without resentment, despite the early hour, because she loved this time, this secret part of the day that belonged to bakers and delivery drivers and the occasional person walking home from a late shift. There was something special about being awake when the rest of the world slept, about working in warm light while darkness pressed against the windows. She dressed in the dark, pulled her hair back, and went downstairs to the bakery. The ovens took time to heat, so she started them first, adjusting the gas, listening for the quiet roar that meant the flames had caught. Then she turned on the lights, and the bakery emerged from darkness, familiar and comforting, every surface and tool exactly where it had been yesterday, where it had been for decades. The workspace was small, efficient, everything arranged for maximum functionality: stainless steel counters for working dough, wooden shelves for proofing, cooling racks for finished loaves. The walls were white tile, easy to clean, and the floor was worn concrete, stained and scarred from years of flour and water and dropped pans. Along one wall stood bags of flour, 50 pounds each, stacked on wooden pallets. Along another wall, jars and containers held the other ingredients: salt, sugar, yeast, oils, seeds, dried fruits. Hannah began by checking the doughs she'd started the night before, the long fermentation breads that developed their flavor slowly over many hours. She lifted the cloth covering a large bowl and looked at the sourdough starter inside. It had risen beautifully, doubling in size, its surface covered with small bubbles. She put her nose close and breathed in the smell, sour and yeasty and alive. This starter was descended from one her grandmother had made 70 years ago, fed and kept alive through 3 generations, a living connection to the past. She took a portion of the starter and began mixing it with flour and water, her hands working the dough, feeling it transform under her touch. At first, it was shaggy and rough, just separate ingredients occupying the same bowl. But as she kneaded, as she folded and pressed and turned, the ingredients began to combine, the gluten strands forming, the dough becoming smooth and elastic, alive under her hands. Kneading was meditation for Hannah. Her hands knew the work so well that her mind could rest, could drift, could simply be present with the texture and temperature and changing consistency of the dough. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. A rhythm as old as bread itself, repeated by billions of hands over thousands of years, unchanged by technology or time. She thought about her grandmother as she kneaded, though thinking wasn't quite the right word. It was more like her grandmother's presence was there in the work, in the smell of the starter, in the motion of the kneading, in the warm bakery at 4 in the morning. Her grandmother had stood in this same spot, had used these same techniques, had made bread for this same neighborhood when the town was smaller, quieter, when everyone knew everyone else's name. The world had changed so much since then. The town had grown, had become a place where strangers lived side by side, where people ordered food through phones instead of talking to shopkeepers, where efficiency was valued over connection. Anna's bakery was an anachronism, a holdout from an earlier time, and she knew it couldn't last forever. The rent kept rising. The big chain bakeries sold bread for half her price. Young people didn't bake at home anymore, didn't know the satisfaction of making something with their own hands. But for now, the bakery still existed. People still came in every morning, still bought her bread, still smiled and said good morning, still created, for those few minutes, a sense of community, of connection, of something more than just a transaction. And as long as they kept coming, she'd keep baking. The dough was ready. Hannah could feel it, the way it pushed back against her hands, the way it held its shape when she stopped kneading. She formed it into a smooth ball, placed it in a clean bowl, covered it with a cloth, and set it aside to rise. This would take 2 hours, and during those 2 hours, she had other work to do. She mixed and shaped loaves of whole wheat bread, of rye bread, of bread studded with walnuts and cranberries. She prepared pastry dough for croissants, rolling and folding butter into the dough, creating the thin layers that would puff and separate in the oven's heat. She shaped baguettes, their long forms elegant and simple, requiring precision and practice to get right. By 6 o'clock, the first loaves were coming out of the oven. The smell of baking bread filled the shop, spilling out into the street through the vent above the door. This smell was advertisement, invitation, promise. It said, something good is being made here, something warm and nourishing and real. Hannah's assistant, a young woman named Yuki, arrived at 6:15 and began preparing the front of the shop, arranging the display case, starting the coffee, setting out the small tables where customers could sit if they wanted to eat here rather than take their bread home. At 7 o'clock, Hana unlocked the front door and turned the sign from closed to open. Within minutes, the first customers arrived. A construction worker who bought a rice ball and hot coffee every morning before heading to his job site. An elderly woman who came for a single sweet roll and stayed to read the newspaper at one of the tables. A mother with a toddler, buying bread for the family's breakfast. Hana greeted each one by name or by face if she didn't know their name yet. She wrapped their purchases carefully, made change, offered a sample of a new pastry she was trying. These small interactions, repeated dozens of times each day, were the real work of the bakery, more important than the bread itself. The bread was just the excuse for connection, the reason people gathered, the medium through which community was made. A man came in that Hana hadn't seen before, middle-aged, wearing a business suit, looking uncomfortable and out of place. He stood uncertainly near the door, looking at the display case but not moving closer. "Good morning," Hana said. "Can I help you find something?" The man looked at her, then looked away quickly, as if eye contact was difficult. "I'm not sure," he said. "I'm new to the neighborhood. I just moved into one of the apartments down the street." "Welcome to the neighborhood," Hana said, and meant it. She came out from behind the counter, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Would you like a recommendation?" The man nodded, still looking uncomfortable. "I don't usually eat breakfast," he said, "but I smelled the bread from the street, and I thought." He trailed off, not finishing the sentence, but Hana understood. She'd seen it before, this particular kind of loneliness, this being new in a place where everyone else seemed to belong. Moving to a new town was hard enough, but moving to a town that had changed so much that even long-time residents felt like strangers, that was even harder. "Try this," she said, selecting a roll from the display case, one filled with sweet red bean paste. "It's my grandmother's recipe, still warm from the oven." She handed it to him, wrapped in paper, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it. He pulled out his wallet, but Hana waved it away. "First one's free," she said, "for new neighbors." The man looked surprised, then touched, then embarrassed, emotions crossing his face in quick succession. "Thank you," he said. "That's very kind." "Come back tomorrow," Hana said. "I'll have fresh baguettes." He nodded, clutching the paper-wrapped roll like it was something precious, and left. Through the window, Hana watched him pause on the sidewalk, unwrap the roll, take a bite. She saw his face change, saw tension release from his shoulders. It was just bread, just flour and water and sugar and yeast. But somehow, it was also comfort, also welcome, also a message that said, "You're not alone here. You belong here. This place has room for you." The morning rush continued. People came and went, bought bread and pastries, drank coffee, chatted with Hana and Yuki, chatted with each other. The bakery became, for those morning hours, a gathering place, a social hub, one of the few places in the increasingly anonymous town where people still connected face to face. By 10 o'clock, the rush had slowed. Most of the bread was sold, the display case looking picked over, nearly empty. This was always satisfying to Hana. This evidence that her work was wanted, needed, consumed. She began cleaning, wiping down counters, washing mixing bowls, sweeping flour from the floor. As she worked, she found her attention drawn to a small object on the windowsill, something that had been there so long she usually didn't notice it anymore. It was a ceramic figurine, about 3 inches tall, shaped like a tanuki, one of the folkloric raccoon dogs that appeared in Japanese stories. Her grandmother had kept it there, claiming it brought good luck to the business. When her grandmother died, no one had thought to remove it, and it had remained, a small guardian watching over the bakery. Hana picked it up, feeling its weight, its smooth glaze, the small imperfections in the ceramic that showed it had been handmade. The tanuki wore a little vest and carried a bottle of sake, its face frozen in a permanent, cheerful expression. There was something both charming and slightly sad about it, this small creature trapped in ceramic, always happy, never changing, watching decade after decade pass while remaining the same. She wondered about the person who had made it, some craftsperson decades ago, shaping clay, painting details, firing it in a kiln. They had probably made dozens or hundreds of these figurines, each one slightly different, each one shaped by their hands. Did they think about where their work would end up? Did they imagine it sitting on a bakery windowsill in a town they'd never visit, watched over by generations of bakers? There was something profound in this, in the way objects carried meaning across time and distance. This figurine was just clay and glaze, but it was also her grandmother's belief in luck, her mother's respect for tradition, and now Hana's own connection to the past. It was a small thread in the fabric of family history, insignificant on its own, but part of a larger pattern that gave shape and meaning to her life. She set the figurine back on the windowsill, positioning it exactly where it had been. Then she continued cleaning, moving through the familiar tasks, bringing order back to the space after the morning's creative chaos. By 11:30, the bakery was clean and restocked for the afternoon, when she'd open again for a few hours to catch people buying bread for dinner. Hana went upstairs to her apartment, kicked off her shoes, and lay down on the couch. Her body was tired, her feet aching, her lower back complaining from the hours of standing and lifting. But it was a good tired, the kind that comes from meaningful work, from making something useful, from serving people. She didn't sleep, just rested, lying still, feeling her body decompress, her muscles releasing their tension. Through the open window, she could hear the sounds of the town going about its business. Cars passing, conversations on the sidewalk, a dog barking somewhere, a child laughing. The ordinary sounds of ordinary life. Nothing special, nothing dramatic, but somehow beautiful in their ordinariness, in the way they testified to people living, continuing, making their way through another day. After an hour, Hana rose and prepared herself a simple lunch: rice, leftover miso soup, pickled vegetables, and of course a piece of her own bread, whole wheat with sesame seeds. She ate at the small table by the window, looking down at the street, watching people pass, wondering about their lives, their stories, where they were going, what they were hoping for. She thought about the man who had come in that morning, the new neighbor with his uncomfortable suit and his loneliness. She hoped he would come back, hoped he'd find his way in this town, hoped he'd discover that it was possible to build a life anywhere if you were willing to be patient, to show up, to let connection happen slowly. That was the secret, really. Not trying too hard, not forcing things, but just showing up consistently, day after day, and allowing relationships to form naturally, the way bread rises, the way dough ferments, slowly and in its own time. You couldn't rush it. You could only create the conditions and wait. She finished her lunch, washed her dishes, and lay down again for a short nap before the afternoon opening. As sleep pulled her down, her last conscious thought was of tomorrow morning, of waking again at 3:30, of starting the ovens, of mixing dough, of doing it all again. The repetition that some people would find monotonous was, to her, deeply satisfying. It was knowing what she was meant to do and doing it, finding purpose not in achievement or recognition, but in service, in craft, in the daily renewal of an ancient practice. On the edge of a village so small it had no name on any map, there lived a woman named Ayame who spent her days watching clouds. This was not a profession, not something anyone paid her to do. It was simply what she did, what she had done for the past 20 years, ever since she had retired from her job as a teacher and returned to the village of her childhood. She had a chair, plain wood worn smooth by use, that she kept on the small veranda outside her house. Each morning after breakfast, she would carry a cup of tea outside, settle into this chair, and look up at the sky. She would sit there for hours, sometimes the whole day, just watching clouds form and dissolve, watching the sky change from dawn pink to noon blue to evening gold, watching birds cross overhead, watching the slow wheel of the seasons turn. People in the village thought she was strange, possibly senile, certainly wasting her time. What was the point of watching clouds? They came and went whether you watched them or not. They didn't need observation. They didn't care if anyone saw them. Watching clouds produced nothing, accomplished nothing, contributed nothing to the practical work of staying alive. But Ayame knew something these people didn't know or had forgotten. She knew that attention itself was valuable, that the act of watching with full presence was its own kind of work, its own kind of contribution. She was not wasting time. She was spending it deliberately and joyously on something that mattered to her in ways she couldn't fully explain. On this particular autumn morning, Ayame carried her tea outside just as the sun was breaking over the eastern hills. The sky was mostly clear, pale blue deepening to darker blue overhead, but on the horizon hung a thin line of clouds, gray, white, and soft-looking, like a blanket someone had left across the hills. She settled into her chair, sipped her tea, and watched these clouds. They were moving, but so slowly you had to watch for several minutes to notice the change. They were also changing shape, parts of them thinning and disappearing, other parts thickening and becoming more defined. Cloud watching taught you patience, taught you that most things in the world changed too slowly to be seen in a glance, that you had to give time. As the sun rose higher, it lit the clouds from below, turning their undersides pink, then orange, then gold. The top surfaces remained gray-white, creating a beautiful contrast, darkness and light existing together, each making the other more visible. Ayame thought about how this was true of life as well, how sorrow made joy more vivid, how difficulty made ease more sweet, how you needed both, couldn't fully appreciate one without the other. The line of clouds gradually dissolved as the sun warmed the air, and by mid-morning the sky was almost entirely clear except for a few small clouds scattered here and there, moving slowly west to east, their shadows sliding across the fields and hills below. Ayame watched one particular cloud, following it across the sky. It was small, fluffy, the kind of cloud children drew in pictures. It moved steadily, maintaining its shape for a long time, longer than she expected. Then, as she watched, one edge began to fray, small wisps pulling away like cotton candy being torn. The fraying spread, the cloud's outline becoming less distinct, its body becoming more translucent. After 20 minutes, it was gone completely, dispersed into invisible water vapor, still present in the air but no longer visible, no longer readable as cloud. Where had it gone? Nowhere, really. It had simply changed form, from visible to invisible, from particular to general. The water molecules that had made up that cloud still existed, would drift on wind currents, would eventually gather together again in some other formation, would become another cloud or would fall as rain or snow, would return to earth and then evaporate again and rise, and the cycle would continue, endless and amazing. She thought about her own life, how it too was a kind of cloud, a temporary gathering of elements that had come together for a while and would someday disperse. Her body was made of atoms that had been part of other beings before her, that would be part of other beings after her. Her thoughts and memories and personality, the thing she called herself, this too was temporary, a pattern that would dissolve when her brain stopped working, when the specific arrangement of neurons that created her consciousness came apart. This could have been frightening, this understanding of impermanence, of the temporary nature of self. But for Ayame, it was comforting. It meant she was part of something larger, something ongoing. She wasn't separate from the world, but woven into it, made of the same stuff as clouds and trees and rivers and stars. When she died, she would return to that stuff, would become available to be reformed into other shapes, other lives. Nothing would be lost except the particular arrangement, and even that loss was necessary, was what made room for new arrangements, new forms, new clouds in the endless sky. Around noon, Ayame went inside to prepare lunch. She ate simply, the same meal she ate every day: rice, pickled vegetables, tofu, green tea. She wasn't attached to variety. She'd learned that the pleasure of eating came not from novelty but from attention, from tasting fully, from gratitude for the gift of nourishment. The same meal could be experienced as boring or as miraculous, depending entirely on the quality of attention brought to it. After lunch, she returned to her chair on the veranda. The afternoon sky had changed. Now there were many clouds, larger ones, building upward, their tops bright white where the sun hit them, their bottoms darker, heavy with moisture. These were the kind of clouds that might bring rain later, and Ayame watched them with particular interest, seeing how they grew, how they piled up on themselves, how the warm, moist air rose and cooled and condensed into these towering structures of water and air. One cloud in particular caught her attention. It was larger than the others, its top reaching high into the sky, flattening out where it hit some invisible boundary layer, some altitude where the air was too cold or too thin to support further growth. This flat top gave the cloud an anvil shape, and Ayame knew from years of watching that this kind of cloud often brought storms. She watched it develop, watched its internal structure change, darker areas appearing within it, signs of rain forming within the cloud's body. After an hour, she saw the first evidence of rain, a gray column hanging below the cloud, precipitation falling from sky to earth, though it was too far away for her to hear or feel. The rain column moved with the cloud, sweeping across the landscape, watering fields and forests, filling streams, soaking into earth. Ayame thought about all the life that depended on this rain, all the roots that would drink it in, all the seeds that would use it to germinate, all the creatures that would drink from puddles and streams. The cloud was giving itself away, was sacrificing its form to nourish the earth, and in that sacrifice was a kind of love, a kind of selflessness that had no name but was the foundation of all life. The storm cloud passed, moving east, and the sky began to clear again. Late afternoon light slanted across the village, golden and soft, illuminating things from the side so their textures showed, so shadows lengthened and depth appeared. Ayame loved this light, the way it transformed ordinary things into something beautiful, something worth looking at with full attention. She thought about her years of teaching, all those students she'd worked with, all the lessons she'd tried to impart. What had she really taught them? Facts, certainly, skills. But looking back now, she realized the most important thing she'd tried to teach, though she'd never said it explicitly, was attention. How to look closely, how to listen fully, how to be present with what was in front of you rather than always thinking about what was next. Most of them hadn't learned it. They'd been too young, too distracted by grades and social dynamics and the urgent business of figuring out who they were. But maybe some of them had absorbed it without knowing. Maybe it had planted a seed that would grow later, in adulthood, when life had slowed down enough for them to remember that teacher who always stopped to point out the light on leaves, who asked them to write about what they noticed rather than what they thought they should notice. As evening approached, Ayame watched the sunset develop. First the clouds turned pink, then orange, then deep red. The sky behind them went through its own progression of colors, blue to purple to nearly black. The whole western sky became a canvas of color, shifting and changing moment by moment, each moment perfect and unrepeatable. She thought about how many sunsets she'd watched in her life. Thousands, certainly, tens of thousands, each one different, each one the same. The fact of the earth turning, the sun dipping below the horizon, this happened every day, without fail, had happened since the earth and sun came into being, would continue happening long after humans were gone. There was comfort in this regularity, this daily reminder that existence was larger than any individual life, that the great patterns continued regardless of what happened in small human dramas. When the last color had faded from the sky and night had settled completely, Ayame went inside. She lit a lamp, made a small dinner, ate it slowly. Then she sat at her low table and wrote in her journal, as she did every night. Just a few lines about what she'd seen, which clouds, which colors, which patterns in the sky, a record not for anyone else but for herself, a way of marking time, of acknowledging that each day had been witnessed, had been received with attention. Before sleeping, she stood at her window looking out at the night sky. The clouds had cleared completely, and stars filled the sky from horizon to horizon, more stars than it seemed possible for a sky to hold. She recognized a few constellations from her childhood, patterns her father had taught her, stories written in stars, Orion's Belt, the Big Dipper, Cassiopeia. But mostly, she just looked at the overall pattern, the Milky Way streaming across the darkness, billions of stars in a river of light. Each star was a sun she knew, many of them larger than the sun that lit her days. And around many of those stars, planets probably circled, and on some of those planets, perhaps, someone or something was looking up at their own night sky, seeing the same kinds of patterns, feeling the same kind of awe. This vastness could have made her feel small and insignificant, but instead, it made her feel connected. She was made of the same elements as those stars, was part of the same universe, was subject to the same laws. The atoms in her body had been forged in the hearts of ancient stars that had lived and died before the earth existed. She was, quite literally, stardust, and so was everyone and everything else. This wasn't poetry. It was physics. It was simple truth. She smiled at this thought, at the wonderful strangeness of existence, at the fact that the universe had arranged itself in such a way that part of it could look at another part and feel wonder. Consciousness was the universe becoming aware of itself, and she was a tiny point of that awareness, a small window through which existence looked at itself. With that thought, she left the window and lay down on her futon. Sleep came quickly. pulling her down into dreams that she wouldn't remember but that would do their mysterious work, processing the day, storing what needed storing, releasing what didn't. And tomorrow she would wake, would make tea, would carry it out to her chair on the veranda, would look up at the sky and see what new shapes the clouds had taken, what new stories they had to tell to anyone willing to watch. And so our 6 stories come to a close. 6 lives, 6 practices, 6 ways of finding peace in the simple act of paying attention. Keiko and her paper, Toshi and his stone, Etsuko and her temple, Kenji and his rivers, Hana and her bread, Ayame and her clouds. Each one teaching the same lesson in different ways, that peace comes not from achievement or acquisition, but from presence, from being fully where you are with what is. As you lie here now, in your own darkness, in your own stillness, perhaps you can take something from these stories. Not anything you need to remember or carry, not any task or obligation. Just the quiet knowing that this moment, right now, is enough. You don't need to be anywhere else or anyone else. You don't need to do anything or become anything. You can simply rest, simply be, simply allow sleep to find you when it's ready. Your breath continues in and out like water flowing, like clouds forming and dissolving, like the daily turning of the earth. You are held by the same forces that hold everything, the gravity that keeps planets in their orbits, the momentum that carries rivers to the sea, the patient unfolding of time itself. Let yourself settle now, like leaves falling to earth, like stones sinking in water, like light fading from the sky at day's end. Everything in its time, everything finding its place to rest. Sleep well, dear friend. The world will still be here tomorrow, with its rivers and gardens, its temples and bakeries, its clouds and stones, and all the patient, beautiful things waiting to be noticed by anyone willing to stop and look. Rest now, rest deeply, rest well.